Here at IPI, we focus on issues of innovation, economic growth, individual liberty, economic liberty. And so the work that Matt Ridley has done during his career obviously is right up our alley and intersects with a lot of the things that we work on. So we've been fans of Matt's work for many years. Matt's book, How Innovation Works, I think is really a modern classic on the topic. And most people who have read Matt's books know him from books like The Rational Optimist and The Red Queen. Matt has a website. It's mattridley.co.uk, where you can find out all the information about Matt that you'd like to know. So we're going to give only sort of a brief bio here because you can avail yourself of a more extended bio if you wish. Matt's books have sold over 1 million copies in 31 different languages. He writes a weekly column for the Times of London and writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal here in the US. His TED Talk, provocatively titled When Ideas Have Sex, has been viewed more than 2 million times. Matt is a science writer by profession, so it must have been an irresistible challenge for Matt to dig into the origin of the COVID-19 virus, which he did, along with Alina Chan, who's a molecular biologist at MIT. The two of them have written this book, Viral, which came out last November. It's called Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. It's great. I've read it, and that's the topic of our talk today. Matt, we really appreciate you making time for us today. I know that our audience wants to hear you talk a bit about the things that you observed and that you uncovered in the course of writing the book Viral. And many of our audience has ordered copies of the book through this event today, so they'll be getting those copies shortly. But I'm also intrigued by the fact that there have been many new developments, I think, and many new insights since you published the book. This must be one of the frustrating things about being a science writer, because discovery continues to go on after you've sent the final galleys back to the publisher. So I'm also looking forward to hearing about some of the things that we've learned and that we've observed since the publishing of your book. So with that, I will thank you one more time, Matt, for making time for us today, and I'll turn the program over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tom, very much indeed. And it's great to be with you. You're right that it's frustrating writing about a moving target and having to catch up. And I'm actually just right in the middle of writing revisions for the paperback. And I was reading a book at lunchtime by a friend about medieval manuscripts. And I was thinking how lucky she was not to have to deal with breaking news. But actually, that's not true, because, you know, the book suddenly says a few years ago, somebody discovered a new manuscript in a library somewhere, which changed the history of the story. So there we are. And there's a similarity there. We are dealing with a manuscript mainly, and the manuscript is the genome of this virus. That's the piece of text, 30,000 characters long, which tells us quite a bit about what it is, where it came from, and what it does. And interpreting the sequences of code inside that genome is a big part of the story. So let me start with what we do know for sure. This is a virus. It's a coronavirus. It's a beta coronavirus, which is one of the 4 kinds of coronavirus. And it's a SARS-CoV-virus. That's a SARS-like beta coronavirus. It's only the second SARS-CoV virus that's come into the human race. It's pretty closely related to SARS-1, the one that broke out in 2002-3. And comparing this pandemic with that epidemic is very interesting, because in the case of SARS, first noticed in February 2003, backdated to the first cases getting infected in October 2002, and a very clear pattern emerging very quickly that the people catching it first were food handlers, were chefs or people who were dealing with food in markets and things like that. And from there, it was scientists very quickly picked up that people handling wild animals in markets for sale in Guangdong province had a lot of antibodies to this virus. So clearly the virus has been circulating undetected in the people handling animals. They tested the animals. They quickly found that palm civets were heavily infected. They found that they weren't catching them on the palm civets on the farms were not infected, but somewhere in the trade between the farm and the market, they were getting collected. And they sampled wildlife in and around Hong Kong and found similar viruses in bats. And so the search began for the actual bat that was carrying the virus, et cetera, et cetera. problem solved within a few months, basically, as to how this epidemic had started. Something very similar happened in the case of MERS, Nipah, which is a virus broke out in Malaysia a few years ago, Hendra in Australia, etc., etc. So we expected, in this case, to hear a similar story. Some of the early cases in Wuhan were connected with a market, the Wuhanan seafood market, and the first story coming out of China was that this was definitely where it had been picked up. And given the much superior genetic technologies we have today compared with 20 years ago, it should have been a matter of days to figure out where this virus was coming from and why people were catching it. That's not proved to be the case. 2 years later, we still don't know how this pandemic began. And let me stress that. Anyone who says that we do know, either because it came through a laboratory or it came through a market, is wrong. We don't have dispositive, definitive evidence either way. What we have is a series of clues that lead us into different alleyways. And what Alina Chan and I have done in our book is follow those clues. And at the end of the alleyway, there's either a brick wall or there's a great big gaping dark hole with information we don't yet have. And we try and make it clear to the reader what information is reliable, what's not, so that they can make up their own mind about this mystery. We had expected to be overtaken by events. While we were writing the book, starting a little under a year ago, a little over a year ago, I should say, we had expected that by the time we came along to here, we would know the answer one way or the other. But we still thought it was an interesting story to tell. But we don't know the answer. So, as I say, there's no evidence that it came through that market. Yes, there were infected cases in the market, and yes, there were positive samples in the market, but they were all so-called environmental samples, countertops, sewage, doorknobs, things like that. No infected animals, no infected food samples. And it was only one of 2 strains by then, the market strain. So where the other strain came from, we don't know. Furthermore, the Chinese authorities have tested 80,000 animals since then in markets, on farms, in the wild, all across China, and they haven't found a single case of an infected animal. Now, of course, we're now finding infected animals because animals are catching it off people, particularly cats and mink and so on. But there's no evidence of this virus or even a 99% cousin of it turning up in another animal. And that's really weird. With the technology we have available today, particularly in China, which is very alert to this after SARS, it should have been easy to find the source. So where is the closest relative? Well, the one thing we know for sure is that this virus, the natural habitat, the reservoir of this virus is the horseshoe bat genus. There's about 100 horseshoe bats in the world. There's a particularly heavy diversity of them in southern China. A lot of them are carrying SARS-like viruses. And we think all SARS-like viruses are basically living in horseshoe bats. The question is, how did a bat virus infect a human being? Now, because of work that's been done to try and trace the origin of SARS, it's pretty clear that you don't find these viruses in the vicinity of Wuhan. There have been very, very few bats found like that near Wuhan, despite sampling of more than 10,000 bats in the area of Wuhan before the pandemic began. You find them much further south. You find them in Yunnan and Guangdong provinces on the southern border of China, roughly 1,000 to 2,000 kilometers away from Wuhan, so a very long way away. But the closest relative to this virus that was found right at the start, a 96.2% similar virus genetically, turned up in the freezer of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It was announced in a paper in Nature, but rather oddly, they didn't say where they'd found it, they didn't say when they'd found it, and they gave a name for it that had no record at all anywhere in the literature, in science, in genetic databases, on the internet. I spent days trying to track down, they've just said they found this virus. It's very similar to SARS-CoV-2. Where did they find it? Who found it? How? In what conditions? It was more than a month before we stumbled upon clues thanks to the work of independent scientists and analysts who are the real heroes of this story, who were digging into Chinese databases. And they found that the story behind this sample, called RATG13, was that in 2012, a number of people had gone into a disused mine shaft in southern Yunnan in Mojiang County to clear out bat guano from the shaft, possibly with a view to reopening the mine for copper mining, possibly just to sell the bat guano for profit, as people do. We don't know which. And 6 of them got really sick, and they were moved to Kunming, the capital of Yunnan, hospital, where they were treated. And the top teams of virologists from all over China were consulted to try and work out what was happening to these guys and to try and save their lives. And 3 of them died. 3 of them managed to recover after a long period. All the teams agreed that it was a virus. All the teams agreed it was almost certainly a bat virus, and it was probably a SARS-like virus. And some of the antibody tests seemed to show that that was indeed the case. Now, if so, this would have been the first ever case of human beings catching a SARS-like virus directly from a bat. So it was of some interest. And yet this outbreak was never reported to the World Health Organization. But when the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which tested the samples from the men's lungs, it also had a team that was looking for viruses in bats. They went to the site 3 times over 2 years, and then another 4 times over the next 2 years, even though it was a very long way from Wuhan. And they collected samples from bats. And in one of these samples, they found this virus that they later called RATG13. They changed the name of it sometime in 2019. Up until 2019, we now know they were calling it 4991. And then when they announced its relation to the pandemic in February 2020, they called it RATG13. That might have been because they were embarrassed. They didn't want the story of the connection with these human beings catching a virus 6 years before coming out. We don't know for sure. But it does raise the possibility. Oh, and by the way, they told us that they had sequenced it in 2020 after the pandemic began, or at least they implied that. We later discovered, my co-author particularly discovered that no, they had sequenced this virus in 2017 and 2018. So they were actively working on it. It wasn't just sitting in the freezer a year before the pandemic. But it's not the virus that causes this disease. It's not COVID. It's very closely related, but it's far enough apart that it can't be it. So either it's been changed in the lab through mutation naturally or through a deliberate experimentation, or this is a red herring and there's a closer virus out there circulating in people and animals that we haven't yet discovered. But either way, we need to take seriously the possibility that there was an accident in a laboratory that led to someone getting infected. It's worth looking at the history of lab leaks just to drive this point home. Laboratory leaks have occurred numerous times in the most secure laboratories all over the world. Smallpox in the UK, anthrax in the USSR, several incidents in the USA, etc., etc. There was a brucellosis epidemic in China caused by a leak of a bacterium in 2019, funnily enough, just before this pandemic. There was a global flu pandemic in 1977 caused by a faulty vaccine. So, accidents happen in research. Not very often, but they do happen. In SARS, we know of 6 cases at least when human beings caught SARS in the lab. Once in Singapore, once in Taiwan, and 4 times in Beijing. And in all but one of those cases, the Taiwan case, we don't know how it happened. We know that a researcher was working in a lab on SARS viruses and caught SARS. Now, they've caught them there because there is no SARS in the environment by the time these experiments are happening. So you couldn't have caught it any other way. So these are very easy viruses to catch if you happen to, puncture your glove or drop a test tube or not have your mask on right or whatever it is. And we know the experiments they were doing on SARS-like viruses in the Wuhan Institute of Virology involved mostly working at biosecurity level 2. That is to say, wearing a mask and gloves. You don't actually have to wear a mask at biosecurity level 2. You just got to be a little bit careful. Okay, so it's not much better than a dentist's office. Biosecurity level 3, where they were doing experiments on humanized mice with human genes on, infecting them with SARS-like viruses, that's much more secure. You actually work in a sealed negative pressure chamber and so on. And the experiments they were doing in these laboratories, we've gradually pieced together what it is. This was the most active research lab working on SARS-like coronaviruses in the world by a mile, right? It's not just one of many labs working on these viruses. It was the one that had produced the most papers on these topics by a very large margin. And the experiments involved taking the viruses into the lab, sequencing their genomes, trying to grow live viruses in cells, succeeding only in a few cases, but then wanting to test newly caught viruses from the wild to see how dangerous they were in human cells. And to do that, because you can't grow most of these viruses, what you do is you take a little part of the spike gene out of the virus that you're interested in, and you put it into one of the viruses you can grow, swapping it for that part of the spike gene in the virus. And you then test it on human cells or humanized mice. In those experiments, they sometimes increased the infectivity of the virus up to 10,000 times, and they sometimes increased the virulence of the virus up to 3 times. So these were significant gain of function experiments by any measure. Which viruses were they working on? Well, we don't know for sure, because they published details of all the viruses they were working on, including 100 SARS-like viruses, up to 2016. But they have published nothing since then on the viruses they were working on since then. In 2020, thanks to the work of a Spanish data analyst, we worked out that they had 8 other very closely related viruses to the one causing the pandemic, also from that mine shaft in Mojiang, that they had never published. We figured this out through some data that they had dumped on the internet, which inadvertently gave a clue as to the existence of these other 8 viruses. 6 months later, they admitted, yes, we did have them. So when they say, as they often do now, look, what can we tell you? We've told you what we're doing. It's just simply not true. There's a lot of information they haven't published. There is a database at the Wuhan Institute of Virology on which all of the virus samples they were working on are recorded, including the location where they were collected, the sequence, if they've sequenced it, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, that database went offline at 2 a.m. on the 12th of September, 2019, and it's never been accessible since. When asked why, we're told, oh, people kept trying to hack it. Well, it's quite unlikely they were trying to hack it in September 2019. And anyway, what's the problem? The point of a database is to share it with the world when there's a pandemic. The purpose of all this research, remember, was to predict and prevent the next pandemic. Well, which pandemic are they waiting for before they share the information that's in the database? You can sense frustration in my voice that we're having to talk about these things. Let me quickly rattle through some of the things that have happened since our book came out. The first was, to everyone's surprise, a virus was found in Laos in a bat that is even more closely related to the one causing the pandemic than the one that came out of the freezer in Wuhan. Now that seems to let the lab off the hook, and it's been welcomed as such. It's only very slightly more. It's 96.8% instead of 96.2% the same. So it's still not the virus itself. How did it get from Laos to Wuhan? Alina and I pointed out that there are entries in genetic databases of viruses that were collected in Laos by an American research group called the EcoHealth Alliance and deposited at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That the EcoHealth Alliance was using the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China as a place to park viruses they found in Laos, among other countries. So I'm sorry, it's possible that it was a scientist that took it from Laos to Beijing, not to Beijing, to Wuhan. We don't know that for sure. When I pointed this out, the EcoHealth Alliance tweeted, no, we never did that. So I said, well, here's an entry in a genetic database saying you did do that. they replied, sorry, they didn't reply. So I said, look, please, could you reply? It's really important. They didn't reply. This went on 4 times. I eventually gave up. This is an American foundation, right? Paid for with grants from the American taxpayer. And it's refusing to divulge this crucial bit of information. Another thing that happened since our book came out is that Michael Warby of the University of Arizona published a paper saying, I've looked into the early cases. Most of them are connected with the market. I don't think this is ascertainment bias. I can go into what that is if you like. And in fact, the earliest case was not the accountant who got ill on the 8th of December. It was a vendor in the market who got ill on the 10th of December. Well, that's too late to be the first case. We all agree. Nobody thinks that was the very first case. This is just the first case we can be sure of identifying in a hospital. And B, his argument was that the accountant had gone to hospital on the 8th of December because he had toothache, not because he had pneumonia. Well, it turns out that actually it was his son who had toothache, if you read the documents carefully. So that was a mistake that rather undid his argument. Either way, nothing has changed as a result of that, even though there were headlines around the world saying patient 0 has now been identified in the market. That's just nonsense. It's not the case. The other thing that happened just about the time we were finishing our book is that a document dropped onto our desk, not our desk, everybody's desk, called the defuse proposal. This was a proposal put to DARPA of the Pentagon for $14 million to study SARS-like viruses in China with the collaboration of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And it was put there by the EcoHealth Alliance. It was turned down, which is important to note. But nonetheless, it described a lot of experiments that they wanted to do, that they were planning to do, and that they might already have started doing, because that's quite often what you do in a grant proposal. And one of those involved something called the furin cleavage site, which is the key, which is a little piece of genetic text that's found in this virus and no other SARS-like viruses we've ever seen anywhere in the world. And it's inserted. It's not just replacing another piece of text, it's adding a text, 12 base pairs long in genetic terms. And it is what makes the virus so infectious. Without that, we wouldn't be having a pandemic. There's no question of that. The furin cleavage site has been inserted into viruses in labs deliberately to make them easier to grow in laboratories on at least 11 different occasions that we can find, quite legitimately. Was it ever done with a SARS-like virus? Well, the Wuhan Institute of Virology did it to a MERS-like coronavirus. And this document shows that they were planning to do it to a SARS-like virus for the first time. So the way my co-author puts this is that a document appears in which people talk about making a unicorn. And, people talk about putting a horn on a horse. And a few months later, a unicorn turns up in the very same city. That's pretty strange. What's even more strange is that in all the months that the investigation of the origin of this virus has been going on, Dr. Peter Daszak, the head of the EcoHealth Alliance, who was on the World Health Organization panel investigating this, went to China, who led the development of a letter to the Lancet ruling out a lab leak, never once mentioned that he was the lead investigator on an application to the Pentagon to put a furin cleavage site into a SARS-like virus, even while he put his name to documents saying that the furin cleavage site is quite natural. So all of this leads us to the conclusion that we don't know how it happened. It could go either way still, but we think a laboratory leak needs to be taken extremely seriously and investigated properly and credibly. And we're not seeing that happening, either by the Chinese or by the World Health Organization, which has allowed itself to be, frankly, a joke in all this, or by anybody else. At that point, I'll stop and take some questions. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Matt, I think the way we'll proceed is that Dr. Matthews and I will engage you in a couple of questions, and then we'll go to the audience. And you have been notably careful to distinguish between what we know and what we don't know, but I can't let you get away without relating the joke about Hershey, Pennsylvania.
Well, it's not my joke, it's Jon Stewart's joke. Is it true that all the chocolate in America is made in Hershey, Pennsylvania?
Quite a bit.
Yeah. Okay, so or most of it, yeah. So if a chocolate problem happens in Hershey, Pennsylvania, you don't go, well, it's nothing to do with the chocolate factory. If a SARS-like virus starts a pandemic in Wuhan, it's pretty similar. I mean,
yep.
Or let's say, a virus from outer space suddenly starts a pandemic on planet Earth that we know came from the moon, and it starts in Houston, Texas. I mean, you'd think, well, hang on, NASA's got something to do with that. That's right. That's the level of probability we're talking about.
Yep. There seems to be a lot of, there's along those lines, there's an expression where there's smoke, there's often fire. And there seems to be an awful lot of covering up that seems to be going on. You talk about databases that disappeared just a couple of months before the first supposed case and things like that. If people don't have anything to hide, they sure are trying to hide it, it looks like. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, from the very start, early in January 2020, the Chinese government ordered all scientists in China to publish nothing, say nothing, communicate nothing to the media, including the sequence of the virus. The scientist who did share that was punished for doing so. So it's not surprising that there's a degree of secrecy here, because that is the way this regime operates. That doesn't, in my view, excuse the behavior, because we all know that the one way that you learn how to prevent a pandemic is to share information. And this would be completely unacceptable in any other country, or indeed in any other industry. I mean, think about the airline industry. If an airliner crashes, the information from the black box is not kept secret. It is made available to the world so that all airline operators can learn from it. That's what we need. What is more surprising in this case is the number of Western scientists who are prepared to have information dragged kicking and screaming out of them. There's a letter gone today from the Republicans on the Oversight Committee in House of Representatives to the National Institutes of Health, saying basically, we've been asking you since May for information about the correspondence with the EcoHealth Alliance, about the Wuhan Institute of Virology's grant money that came from the American taxpayer through the EcoHealth Alliance. You've given us excuse after excuse that the dog ate your homework. It's not good enough. You've got to give us information. Why should it be like this? Why shouldn't we have complete openness? There's a bunch of emails came into the public domain through the same route about 2.5 weeks ago, which concern a meeting that happened on the 1st of February 2020 with Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins, and from the UK, Patrick Vallance, Jeremy Farrar, and about 10 others. And basically what we now know is that in that meeting, all these virologists said, this looks awfully like it came out of a lab. Not all of them, but most of them said that. The outcome of the meeting was to draft a paper saying the one thing we know is that it couldn't possibly have come out of a lab. It's not clear why they changed their minds, but there are hints in these emails, and the hints are that it would damage the reputation of science, and Chinese science in particular. That's the reason for basically writing the opposite of what you think in an article, it seems. And that's pretty extraordinary that we're in this situation, trying to get information out of our own governments in the West that, frankly, should be made available.
I heard you describe that meeting last fall in some podcasts that you did, and you expressed sort of that you were mystified that going into the meeting, the lab leak theory was given serious consideration by some of these people. Then they come out of the meeting and they all share one uniform opinion that it could not possibly be a lab leak. And sort of that was the state of things last fall, I think. But as you say, now this tranche of emails has come out that suggests that there's some political considerations and some covering of asses that is going on among some of these folks, at least.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to ask you one more question, and then I'll turn things over to Dr. Matthews. A few weeks ago, there was a paper that came out, a research paper that suggested that the origin of the Omicron variant is a result of the Delta variant essentially jumping into the animal population. I think it was the rodent population or something, mutating within the rodent population and then jumping back into the human population. Have you heard that? Have you looked into that? And does that seem like a reasonable thing to you?
I've looked into it a little bit, but not as much as to be very confident to have my own view yet. But you got one thing wrong there, which is that it wasn't the Delta variant that is the ancestor of the Omicron variant. It's a very odd fact that Omicron is descended from a 2020 version of the virus, not a 2021 version of the virus. So it's been hiding somewhere for a year before it appeared. It's not been. The Delta is its cousin, not its grandmother, if you put it like that.
Okay.
And it's very different. I mean, it's got a lot of mutations compared with Delta. The vast majority of those are non-synonymous mutations. Now, what that means is that they do change the virus. About 2/3 of mutations are so-called silent or synonymous mutations, which don't change a genetic codes, don't change what the genetic codes gets translated into. It's very odd to find the vast majority of mutations being non-synonymous, being effectively functional, as it were. It implies non-natural evolution. It implies either very strong selection somewhere or deliberate alteration. I think it's very unlikely that someone has deliberately made this. The mouse connection is really interesting. A Chinese group looked at Omicron and said, let's categorize all the mutations that have happened in terms of how well they make the virus fit the receptors of different mammals. And the mouse stood out like a sore thumb as being the one that this virus seems to be particularly well designed for. So the suggestion is that sometime in 2020, a mouse caught COVID from people or something. And then sometime towards the end of 2021, probably in South Africa, a mouse gave it back to people. Now, was that mouse a wild mouse? By the way, it's not a rat, it's a mouse. Was that mouse a wild mouse or was it a laboratory mouse? After all, mice are used extensively in laboratories. We don't know. And I'm not here to say that we're looking at a second lab leak or anything like that. I've absolutely no idea whether that's the case. I think we need to look into that completely separately from this to see but it's not completely impossible. You can't rule it out a priori without examining it.
Okay, I'll ask you to comment on one more thing, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Matthews. We should be explicit, I think, in pointing out that the lab leak theory does not necessarily imply bioweapon research, because there has been, at least among some of the fringes, there have been some accusations that this was, bioweapons research. So I assume you agree that we need to be very careful that the lab leak theory does not necessarily imply that.
No, indeed. And there's two reasons why we think that's extremely unlikely. The first is that the reason they were doing this research is obviously what they said on the tin, which is they wanted to understand SARS-like viruses, they wanted to predict the next pandemic, they wanted eventually to be able to prevent pandemics, et cetera, et cetera. There's no doubt that that's what they were up to, as it were. The second reason is because if you were going to develop a bioweapon, you wouldn't do it in Wuhan, the city where you're doing all your SARS coronavirus research. It's going to look too suspicious. You'd do it in Mongolia or something. And you certainly wouldn't, deliberately release it into a city of 11 million people without having already developed a vaccine or whatever it might be. So it just doesn't pass the smell test that this is anything to, well, the military was interested in this kind of research. We know there's not much doubt about that, but that they had got to the point of designing viruses with a view to making them into weapons. We don't think there's any likelihood of that. But this pandemic has taught us just how dangerous a highly transmissible virus is. It doesn't have to be very lethal. The fact that it's highly transmissible is what makes it impossible to control. And it's turned the world upside down. And any bad actor is watching that. Kim Jong-un will undoubtedly be thinking, hang on, how do I recruit some virologists? So will Al-Qaeda or their equivalent. I mean, I don't say that for sure, but I say, I'd be surprised if we don't have to step up our defenses against that kind of thing in the years to come.
Very good. I want to remind folks that we're taking questions through the Q&A function, not through the chat function. And with that, let me turn it over to our resident scholar, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, Matt. That was a great presentation. Couple of quick questions. Number one, I think they'll be quick. Number one, you have watched, I assume, the rather aggressive approach from Senator Rand Paul with Dr. Fauci when he's giving testimony. And there's been a lot of going back and forth with Rand Paul suggesting that the U.S. has been funding some of the gain of function efforts in Wuhan. And Fauci saying, we just don't know what you're talking about. What is your assessment of that interaction? And do you think Rand Paul is more on target than Fauci?
Well, part of me is tempted to take the fifth on this and say, look, I don't try to get involved in US political debates. And also, I'm worried that if America gets too hung up on what Dr. Fauci did or what he didn't, to some extent, it lets the Chinese state off the hook. And so there's part of me that doesn't want to dig too deep into this controversy. And you can argue, as Dr. Fauci does, that by his specific definition, or the National Institute of Health specific definition, these experiments did not breach the particular rules that they had set up. But what I don't think you can argue, and where I think Rand Paul is right, is that American money was funding research in Wuhan that did result in viruses gaining in either transmissibility or virulence. There's no doubt about that. I mean, Ben Hu's 2017 paper basically lays out these experiments. It's a public paper, there's nothing secret about it, and says at the end, we acknowledge receipt of US government funding through the National Institutes of Health. So to some extent, they end up arguing tremendously detailed stuff about what words mean. But yes, there were gains of function, and they were funded partly by US taxpayers. Not mostly, but partly. Most of the money was coming from the Chinese Academy of Sciences.
So the second question is, there's been a lot of variation in how countries have responded to a pandemic that comes out like this. So just give us a sort of I'm going to say quick take, but of your assessment of what have we learned from this and what should we think about going forward if and perhaps when another virus comes out that's this pandemic?
Well, that's a huge question, Merrill, and I don't have a very good answer to it, but the importance of getting vaccines ready fast is the big one. This isn't just hindsight. Back in 2019, scientists were saying we're too slow at making vaccines. We've got to get better. It's the one thing that we need. So I think myself, that's the main lesson that the world should learn. But whether or not locking down the whole population infected or uninfected was a good idea is something that I was uncertain about for certainly the first lockdown and a little bit the second lockdown, but now I'm pretty certain it's the wrong thing to do. It doesn't just flatten the curve. It doesn't just take 3 or 4 weeks. You have to do it for months, if in China's case for years. If at all, it's got to be utterly draconian to have an effect. It has brutal side effects on people. And as a paper from Johns Hopkins published just, I think, today, says there's good evidence it hasn't really saved significant numbers of lives. I think a strategy of focused protection of the vulnerable would have been more sensible. Now, you can argue that's not as easy as it sounds. I don't mean to imply that it is, but I do think that that's the way that we should have gone. And, as for closing schools and telling people they couldn't go for walks in parks and things like that, I mean, I think I was just daft. We knew very early on that ventilation and outdoors was a good idea. So why the heck are we locking people inside houses? I don't know. You're more medical than me, Meryl, so you can probably tell me whether I'm talking nonsense.
Well, then let me ask you one more question before we go to the group. You mentioned the vaccine. We had the mRNA come up with both Pfizer and Moderna, and then Johnson & Johnson used a more traditional approach. And there's been a lot of debate about this. People who've taken vaccines for years for other things have pushed back on this. What is your assessment of the new vaccine technology?
Well, it's not as rosy as it was a year ago. I was very excited about the messenger RNA vaccines when they first came along because the speed with which they were produced, because of the cleanness of the technology, meaning that there's likely to be relatively fewer side effects because you've not got other proteins involved, et cetera, et cetera. It seemed to me a wonderful example of an obscure piece of research producing an incredible breakthrough that was going to be very beneficial to mankind and might even help with cancer therapy. As the time has gone by, I don't think the side effects of the vaccines have proved to be any worse than we might have thought, given the speed at which they were developed. There are some, and they shouldn't be ignored, but I don't think that. And by the way, my a Moderna booster knocked me out for 24 hours. It was brutal. So yes, there are side effects, but I do think that their effectiveness does come into question a bit. The fact that we've had to give it to people 3 times, and now Omicron is infecting people who've been thrice vaccinated, means that we can't be quite as bullish about this technology as I would like to be. But I do think it's relatively early days still. They've had huge problems working out how to package messenger RNA inside lipid nanoparticles to make them not create side effects. I'm sure that'll get better. So I hope we don't end up being anti-vax as a result of this. And the one way to make people anti-vax, in my view, is to make it compulsory and force it down people's throats. I think that backfires. I think we've got to persuade rather than to force people to have vaccines.
Tom, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. We have lots of questions, but we also have a good bit of time, so we will try to get through as many of them as possible. We have a question from David Nelson. David notes your criticism of both the US and China and the WHO for suppressing information rather than being transparent, but he wants to know about other governments and whether they are digging into the question, particularly the UK government. And he notes the role of the Wellcome Trust, which I'm completely unfamiliar with. So that's question number one.
The Wellcome Trust is a huge funder of medical research worldwide. It's based on a pharmaceutical company based out of the UK. It's enormous, and it therefore plays a huge part in all this. Frankly, I'm really disappointed by the UK on this. It's a leading biomedical country, has been for a number of years. It's not quite America, but it's not far behind. And in some ways it's ahead. And yet I've found very, very few people prepared to discuss this, debate this, look into this, divert their research interests into this. I approached the Royal Society and said, shouldn't we be having a debate about this? And I was told, well, no, we only have debates about scientific issues. Well, if this isn't a scientific issue, I don't know what is. asked the government on a number of occasions what they were doing to look into the origin of COVID-19. And they basically said, we're waiting for the World Health Organization to report. I think a lot of other countries took that view. Now, the World Health Organization took a year and a bit to produce a pathetic report. That's a technical term for what it was. It was very poor, and it basically endorsed the Chinese theory that it might have come in on frozen food. And they didn't even visit the right campus of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They spent a morning at a museum. You know, it was a Potemkin investigation. The existence of that investigation gave other countries like the UK the excuse for doing nothing themselves. And that, for me, is the real horror here, that the World Health Organization effectively got in the way of other countries. Australia called for an investigation into the origin of COVID-19 very early on, and they were punished with significant trade sanctions by China just for asking for an investigation, not for saying anything about a lab leak. They just said, we want to know how this started. And that frightened off a lot of other countries. So I'm afraid there've been some relatively warm words about the need to be open-minded. The Biden administration has been pretty good on warm words. Antony Blinken, it's not done a volte-face from the Trump administration on that, and it said the lab leak remains on the table. But they're not doing much, and frankly, the investigative media, the scientific establishment, the intelligence establishment, frankly, they've been less used to us trying to write a book about this than a bunch of amateur open source analysts working from their basements.
We have a question from Andrew Norris. Andrew wants to know, how did you get connected with your co-author, Dr. Alina Chan? And can you tell us a little bit about her contribution to your research?
Yeah, Alina Chan is an amazing person. And she's the senior author on this book. She is a postdoc at the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT, working on viral vector engineering. So she knows a lot about this kind of stuff. Unable to go into the lab to do experiments in the first lockdown, she got interested in the origin of the virus. She started looking into it. She found out something very important very early on, which was that the virus was very well adapted to infecting human beings. That was surprising. SARS, when it first broke out, wasn't very good at infecting human beings. It had to evolve very fast in order to become so. This looked like it knew all about human cells. It had somewhere been infecting human cells for some time. She said that might imply it's been in a laboratory. That all hell broke loose when she said that. So she began to look into more and more of this stuff. I found her such an intelligent and interesting source for various articles I was writing, mainly for the Wall Street Journal, that I came to rely more and more on her thinking and her questioning and her incredible grasp of detail. And eventually I wrote to her and said, I'd like to put together a book on this topic, but I would like to work with you because a lot of the technical stuff I will need help on. Would you like to be a co-author? And to my astonishment and delight, she said yes. We then spent months sending drafts of chapters back and forth to each other. And then when the book was finished and printed, we met for the first time.
Oh, that's amazing. I want to make an observation of the very high quality of the questions we're getting from our audience. Very impressive. David Wood has a question relating to something you just mentioned, that much of the work that you relied on was done by what David Wood calls a diverse set of online sleuth researchers. You referred to them as open source researchers. Can you tell us a little bit more about that group of people and how important they are to this sort of investigation?
Yeah, this has been one of the fascinating things for me. It's an example of citizen science, which is a very respectable idea that in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence or ornithology or something, you harness amateurs and you say, look, collect your data in the right way and we'll be able to use it. And in many of the stories I told this afternoon about the bat virus from the Mojiang mine, et cetera, it was really important that this information was dug up by amateurs. So just to give you two examples, there's a young man in India called the Seeker, and he's very, very good at using the internet. As he puts it, I know how to make search engines work for me. He got hold of some logins for Chinese official databases, and that enabled him to find a bunch of theses, about 4 theses, that explained what happened to those men who got sick in Kunming, that detailed the collection of viruses from that mine, that showed right up to 2019 what they were doing with those viruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, etc. He did a number of other things. He's incredibly useful. Everybody at first assumed that the Seeker was either CIA or Indian intelligence. The truth is he's just a very smart young man. He's not even trained in science, although he did work as a science teacher at one point. Another one is a guy called Francisco de Ribera in Madrid, who is a business technology consultant who lost his job at the start of the pandemic, got interested in this stuff, and applied some of the forensic skills he learned in business to this problem. So, for example, he says, if you want to find out what's going wrong in a fraudulent in a company, you look for missing data, missing invoices, right? You look at the serial numbers of the invoices, one's missing, you say, can I see that one? It turns out to tell you what's going on. So he looked at the serial numbers of the viruses they were collecting. You could get these from different genetic databases, and he began to piece together where they'd collected each set. So there would be a set of serial numbers from one collecting trip to one cave. So he was able to then to find these other 8 viruses they'd found in Mojiang in that mine shaft and say, hang on, there's another 8 viruses very closely related to the pandemic virus that you have in your freezer. I can tell from the serial numbers you got them from Mojiang. Why haven't you told us about them? Why won't you sequence them? And there was a sort of sheepish addendum added to their paper saying, yeah, there's another 8 viruses, but we don't think they're very important. And Francisco, again, he doesn't have scientific training, but he's jolly well learnt it, and he's learnt it fast. There's lots of others I haven't mentioned. They're loosely grouped under an umbrella called DRASTIC, which is an acronym that I can't really remember. The D stands for decentralized. But like all good anarchic groups, DRASTIC had a bust up, and there's now 2 DRASTICs, and so on. So it's not right to think of them as organized. These are individuals.
Sure. We have a question from Cynthia Clendenin, and this is related to gain of function research being prohibited in the U.S. and whether or not Anthony Fauci and the EcoHealth Alliance seem to have tried to find a way of getting around those sorts of prohibitions by using third parties. Can you tell us anything you know about that?
Yes, I think this is a bit of a red herring. It's true that between 2014 and 2017, the US prohibited the federal funding of gain of function research. But even during that period, there were loopholes. You could continue work that you'd started. You could work on viruses that were not likely to infect human beings, et cetera, et cetera. In 2017, under the Trump administration, that funding pause was ended rather quietly by Dr. Fauci, as far as we can make out. And he had argued against the pause all along. So I think there is a degree of, we don't like this pause, we want to get back to funding this research, et cetera, et cetera. Now, can you argue that by funding the EcoHealth Alliance to pay for similar experiments in China, they were sort of getting around the pause in funding? I think a little bit you can. But remember, most of the funding for that research was coming from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. The reason the Americans were putting money into that project was because that's where the SARS viruses were, that's where they were being collected. They wanted to be part of this. Extraordinarily, though, the National Institutes of Health did not say, if you use our money to collect a virus, then you must share the sequence with us. I mean, even some of the ones collected in Laos, not even in China, but sent to the Wuhanis, appear now to be the private property, secret private property of the Chinese state. You, the American taxpayer, paid for that. That's pretty shocking.
I tend to be pretty supportive of intellectual property protection, but those who pay for things deserve access to them. So we have a question from Andrew Norris that reflects a sort of a common understanding we're hearing about the Omicron variant, and that is this idea that viruses inevitably mutate into forms that are less destructive but more transmissible. And so let's do this as a two-parter. Number one, is that true? And number two, does that mean that the Omicron variant is actually a blessing in disguise?
Well, here I've got to be a little bit careful because my co-author disagrees with me on this. And most scientists disagree with me. I take the view that yes, in one specific case, and that is respiratory viruses. This doesn't apply to all viruses. This is a point that always gets missed in a conversation about this, that it crucially depends on the method of transmission. So viruses that are transmitted by insects don't tend to get less virulent over time. The same is true for ones spread by water, and ones spread by sex tend to be very persistent. They tend to disappear for a long time and then reappear at a later. So they do a lot of hiding inside the body because they're waiting for you to find a new partner, effectively. So we're focused here on respiratory viruses, ones that are spread by coughs and sneezes. Now, mostly they make a living by infecting the mucosa in your nose and throat. They don't want to go deep into the rest of your body and make you sick because they do better they spread better if you're not ill enough to cancel going to a party. The more you're out and about spreading it. And that's why there are 200 different kinds of viruses that cause the common cold. Most of them are rhinoviruses, some of them are adenoviruses, some of them are coronaviruses, and none of them kill you. That can't be a coincidence. Sure, they can kill very, very vulnerable people, but they don't kill ordinary people on the whole. Now, there's one exception to this rule, which is the 1918 influenza epidemic, which started mild and went very nasty very quickly in about August 1918. Paul Ewald came up with he was a professor at Emory University, came up with a very good explanation of why that is. And that is the peculiar conditions of the trenches on the Western Front. Under those conditions, mild cases were not spread and virulent cases were. Because if you had a mild case of flu, you were sent to a dugout to sleep it off. If you were a bad case, you were put on a stretcher, taken back to a field hospital, put on a troop train, sent back to England, infecting people all along the way. So the virulent cases were spreading better than the mild cases. They were effectively using nurses in the way that yellow fever uses mosquitoes, if you see what I mean. That's interesting because in lockdown, remember, in the first lockdown, we told mild cases to stay at home and see nobody. So you couldn't spread it. But the nasty cases went to hospital where they infected nurses who infected other people. So I think we were encouraging that virus to stay virulent for most of 2020. Now, as I say, most virologists disagree with me on that, say I'm talking nonsense. I don't think they've studied enough evolutionary biology, which is my main topic. They don't think I've studied enough medicine. We'll agree to disagree. Is Omicron the mild version of the virus that displaces the nastier ones and becomes effectively the common cold, so we don't need to worry about it? Almost certainly, yes. I think this is the end game for this pandemic. I think it'll become a pretty nasty cold that sometimes kills old people, and it'll stay mild over the next 10 years. I hope I'm right. If I'm wrong on that, well, I am sometimes wrong on lots of things.
That's a great answer. We have to be careful to not anthropomorphize viruses, right? I mean, you'll hear people in common parlance say things like only a stupid virus kills its host. Well, they're not operating from an intelligent standpoint.
No, but it's surprising how, as a shorthand, that does end up describing a passive selection process, or the outcome of it. Right. Yes, but you're dead right not to anthropomorphize it.
We have a question from John Ike, which he admits is a political question rather than a scientific question. Is China ever going to have to pay the price, either for originating the virus or for their lack of transparency and covering up and not being honest brokers of information?
Well, tomorrow is the opening ceremony of the Beijing Winter Olympics. Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, is going as the guest of the Chinese government. He says it would be too political an act to say no to the invitation. Well, I think that's a ridiculous thing to say. First of all, hasn't he got a day job to do? Second of all, he's a bureaucrat, not a politician. So it shouldn't be a political statement to turn down an invitation. But if he does go and does pretend he's a politician, then why on earth is he going when Hong Kong is being crushed, the Uyghurs are being persecuted, and China is not cooperating properly on the origin of the virus? I think that whether we like it or not, we are in a sort of Cold War with China now in the West. We are much more economically dependent on them than we ever were on the Soviet Union, so it's very difficult. And yes, we would like to make it as friendly as possible so that we coax them into behaving better on things like this, because we haven't got the economic or military power to do it any other way. But nor can we ignore the fact that they have just behaved on this subject in a truly reprehensible way, diplomatically, not sharing information in a timely manner. I don't know what the answer to that is. I very much fear that they are waiting for the water to close over the head of this topic. And I very much fear that a lot of people in the West have a vested interest in it doing so. Businessmen, because they want to do business, politicians, because they want to normalize relations, academics, because they want Chinese students to come to their universities, scientists, because they don't want their grants interrupted by any inconvenient information, and so on. So there's not many people in the establishment with a vested interest in picking a fight with China. But I'm not sure the interest of the ordinary person is quite the same there. And I do think that we have to, in order to prevent the next pandemic, in order to honor the 5 million people who've died, etc., we must keep up the pressure on this issue.
We are not going to get to all of our questions. We have a few more minutes. We're not going to get to all of them, but in fairness, many of them were already answered during your presentation. So I think we've done a good job of covering them. We have a question from John Petter, and it's an interesting question because for those of us engaged in ideas, you always have to take your opponent's most serious argument seriously. And so John wants to know, do those who argue for a natural origin, do they have any strong arguments at all?
Very much so. And John is dead right that, you must deal with your opponent's strongest arguments. So one of the things that we've done in our book is we've got 2 chapters right at the end in which we hand the microphone, or the pen, if you like, to an attorney who is addressing a jury. And the first attorney is wanting the jury to think that it was out of the market, and the second is wanting the jury to think it was out of the lab. And we put together the best case we can muster for all these, for each case, for each side of the argument. And frankly, when I reread those chapters, I find each of them quite convincing, even though I wrote them. I drafted them, I should say. Alina contributed to them too. I don't want to suddenly write her out of the picture. We wrote them, is what I should have said. Yes, what are the strong arguments? Well, first of all, there is a connection with the market. A lot of the early cases were in the market. although it looks more like a super spreader event, it's not impossible that something was for sale there. Secondly, the Chinese investigation into the market found no live mammals for sale in the market. We now know that's not true, thanks to a study that was being done on illegal wildlife sales in Wuhan in 2019 by chance. So we know that they missed some animals in the market, and therefore they might have been infected. Thirdly, the argument that there's a lab investigating SARS-like viruses, of course there is. They're worried about the next pandemic. The next pandemic happened. It's like saying there's a fire engine at the scene of a fire. Well, that doesn't prove it caused the fire. And the final point that I would make is that the furin cleavage site is crucial to this virus causing a pandemic. So if this virus didn't have a furin cleavage site, it wouldn't cause a pandemic. That doesn't prove it was put in, if you see what I mean. If there's a wild virus with a furin cleavage site out there and somebody comes across it, then you'll get a pandemic out of it, or you might well get a pandemic out of it. And so in sort of Bayesian logic terms, you can make that argument almost the other way around. We think there's no dispositive, definitive evidence for either hypothesis at the moment, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, and we think at the moment the circumstantial evidence favors the laboratory leak theory, but not by a huge amount.
And to be specific, the circumstantial evidence being something along the lines of some researcher in the lab gets infected and he stops by the market on the way home to grab some groceries, or something like that. And it becomes that way it becomes a super spreader event.
Yeah, exactly. That I wouldn't call that circumstantial evidence. I'd call that speculation. But but you're not wrong. And by the way, sometime in early 2021, the Chinese government brought in a new law increasing the fines for technicians and scientists who sell laboratory animals for food in markets. Just think about that for a second.
Which suggests that it had been going on.
Exactly.
Wow. We have a question from Andrew Norris. So far in this discussion, we've described China as where the research happens and the funding is coming from the US, but Andrew wants to know, how much influence does Chinese lobbying and Chinese funding have in this research?
Yeah, well, the Chinese Academy of Sciences was paying for the vast bulk of the research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The US contribution was about $600,000 over several years. That's a drop in the ocean for the money that went into that lab. So yes, the Chinese state is important in this story. And there is no doubt that the Chinese government is strongly propagandizing on this issue. I mean, you don't have to read very far to find articles calling me a notorious liar and digging up something I said 20 years ago that they think is disgraceful. And they always lead back to a Chinese propaganda unit. There's an amusing story we tell in the book. Sometime in I think it was August 2020, it might have been 2021, I now can't remember, but a man appeared on Twitter called Wilson Edwards, who was and on Facebook, who was a professor of virology in Switzerland. And he was very, very strongly of the view that the US was being extremely irresponsible here, that actually a lab leak in the US might have caused this pandemic, that the Chinese had nothing to complain about, and that to apologize for, I should say, and that the World Health Organization was absolutely right to endorse the Chinese theory of how the virus had begun. The Swiss embassy tweeted in Beijing, "We have no record of a Wilson Edwards in Switzerland, let alone one who's a professor. We note that he appeared on Facebook and Twitter only a few weeks ago and has very few followers. Are you sure he's not a fictional character? He disappeared from Facebook the next day.
Mm. That's really interesting. We have an anonymous question here, and I normally would not take anonymous questions, except I think this one's really valuable. And Matt, we at the Institute for Policy Innovation, we are an accredited NGO with WIPO. We have been accredited ad hoc for events at WHO and things like that. And we've been concerned here institutionally about China's moving to take over control of a lot of these international organizations in order to essentially neuter them as critics of China. And something like that seems to have happened at WHO. So the question that both I and our anonymous questioner ask is, are we getting to the point where some of these international organizations are hopelessly compromised, and do the free nations of the world need to start a new project, such as the one that was done after World War II, of essentially creating and propping up some new international organizations?
Well, I think this is a live issue. I think the World Health Organization is pretty dramatically compromised. If you look at their coverage of this, just to give you an example, in January 2020, they continued to insist that there was no evidence of human-to-human transmission. This was something they were taking from the Chinese authorities. Shortly after that, by the way, by then they knew perfectly well that that wasn't true. There were, healthcare workers were getting infected from treating patients and things like that. So, not all these cases turning up in hospital, they weren't all infected by animals, which was the implication. So they stuck to that line far too long because it suited the Chinese. Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, who, by the way, was made head of the World Health Organization at China's insistence. They went around the world and said to lots of countries, if you vote for this chap, we'll lend you money for a new road or things like that. It was pretty explicit. So he's very much, and he was an Ethiopian politician who was very much connected with China throughout most of his career. He went to Beijing that month, January 2020, saw Xi Jinping and came back and said his admiration for the transparency of the Chinese government on this issue was, quotes, beyond words, quotes. Now, this was at a time when over 200 people had already been disciplined or punished for discussing the virus in China, when some of them had been very significantly punished, when all scientists had been told that they mustn't discuss this topic with the outside world at all without state permission. So transparency is not the word that sprang to mind. And yet his admiration for their transparency was beyond words. He's going to Beijing tomorrow for the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics. It doesn't feel like an organization that is fit for purpose, fit for mission. As I say, its investigation effectively stymied other attempts to do so. I think what the Western governments should do is start a pandemic treaty in which they agree to share information as widely as possible, sign up to this, and eventually shame China into also signing up to it. And I see no advantage in doing this through the World Health Organization, particularly. I think that will just lead it into a bureaucratic quagmire from which it won't emerge.
Let's try to cover two more quick topics because we're getting to the end of the generous time that you have allowed us to have today. We had a question. There have been rumors in the U.S. about a recent defection to the U.S. by a Chinese virologist. Do you know anything about that?
No, not a recent one. There was a virologist who defected a year and a half ago and had some very useful information about the degree to which she and her colleagues had been ordered to say things that weren't true about the spread of the virus, but it didn't shed light on the origin. She also speculated about the origin of the virus. We don't find her speculations convincing, but if there is a defection from within the Wuhan Institute of Virology, that could be very significant, but I know nothing about it.
Okay. And then finally, EcoHealth Alliance keeps coming up in this discussion. And Dr. Peter Daszak, I think is how his name's pronounced. But yet we have heard nothing about any specific investigations into EcoHealth Alliance. We've heard nothing about any kind of congressional hearings. We've heard nothing about any sorts of FBI investigations or anything like that. Doesn't it seem like a little deeper dive into the EcoHealth Alliance and some of their activities is called for, since they keep seeming to show up as a locus related to this kind of research?
Yes, they're very closely collaborating with the World Health, with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Peter Daszak, made many trips there. He was boasting right up until December 2019 about the work they were doing with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, about the experiments they were doing on the viruses and so on. You're right that they must know more than they have been telling us. The National Institutes of Health has been in a increasingly irritated correspondence with them about their failure to give timely information about some of the work that was funded by the NIH. As I mentioned, the Republicans on the Oversight Committee are pressing the NIH to ask more questions of this kind. The Republicans in Congress are very keen to have Dr. Daszak testify. So far, they've not been able to find any Democrats to agree with them, which seems surprising to me, but maybe I don't understand Washington. And without bipartisan approach, subpoenaing him is therefore not possible. I understand he turns down all requests to testify before Congress, but I might be wrong about that. I don't know, I haven't checked. But certainly we haven't seen enough. And he said things that would be very intriguing if he would elaborate on them. So, for example, he appeared at an online seminar about a year ago in which he said, I've seen that database, the one that went offline, and there's nothing in it of any relevance. Well, fine. Could you elaborate? Could you say what is in it? Could you share it with us? Could you ask them to share it with us? Sorry, the question he was asked was, did you ask them when you were in Beijing, in Wuhan, as part of the WHO investigation, did you ask them to share the database? And he said, no, I didn't ask them because I've seen it before and I know it's not relevant. Well, I'm afraid that's just not good enough in this. 5 million people are dead. We don't just take people's words for it that there's nothing relevant in a database. We share the database.
Great point. Matt, you've been extremely generous with us, and this has been a very, very substantive discussion. So I thank you. I want to give you an opportunity to say anything you'd like to say in closing, and then we will wrap things up.
Well, I'd just very much like to thank you for that. And it's great to see some friends listening in, and particularly David, a great question from David Nelson, who's been a good friend over the years, among other people. So thank you all for listening, and great to talk to you. And thanks for your patience. Lovely questions from everybody as well.
Well, Matt, we appreciate your work. We thank you for your work. You have made a solid contribution in so many areas in the world of ideas, and we really appreciate it. And we hope we can call upon you again at some point in the future.